The Phantom Rider is a mysterious figure shrouded in shadow and legend, a vigilante who haunts the hills surrounding Red Bluff County. What will the Marshal Elias Grey do? Dressed in black from head to toe and riding a midnight-colored steed, they appear as a wraith-like presence, dispensing their own brand of justice with a swift and deadly hand. Driven by a deep-seated belief in vengeance for the wronged, the Phantom Rider operates outside the bounds of the law, leaving a trail of fear and whispers in their wake. Are they a ghostly avenger, a fallen hero, or simply a force of nature? Their true identity and motives remain an enigma, making them both feared and in some corners secretly admired. Chapter 1. Shadows in the Hills. The sun dipped low over Red Bluff County, the darkened and overcast rugged hills that surrounded the town. The air was thick with dust from the busy townsfolk, and the faint sound of a harmonica drifted from the saloon. Marshal Elias Grey stood on the wooden porch of his office, his sharp eyes scanning the vast horizon. His broad shoulders were tense, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Something was stirring in the hills, and he could feel it in his bones. Inside the office, Deputy Caleb Boone paced back and forth, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing a mop of unruly light brown hair. He stopped abruptly and turned to Deputy Annie McGraw, who was leaning against the desk, cleaning her rifle. "I'm telling you, Annie," Caleb said, his voice low and urgent. "I saw something out there. A figure on horseback dressed in black. It wasn't no ordinary rider." Annie raised an auburn eyebrow, her green eyes glinting with skepticism. "You sure it wasn't just a shadow, Boone? Or maybe you had one too many drinks at Clara's saloon last night?" Caleb scowled. "You know I don't drink, and I assure you I know what I saw. It was real. And it wasn't no shadow." Marshal Grey stepped inside, his boots creaking on the floorboards. "Enough, both of you," he said, his voice calm but decisive. "We've got enough trouble in this town without chasing ghost stories." "But Marshal," Caleb protested, "there's been talk all over town. Travelers say they've seen the same thing. A rider in black, appearing out of nowhere and disappearing just as quick. And then there's the wagon I found." Elias held up a hand to silence him. "I know about the wagon, burned to ash with that message carved into it. Justice rides at night. It's probably just some outlaw trying to scare folks." Annie smirked. "Or maybe it's Blackjack Morgan playing games again. Wouldn't be the first time he's tried to stir up trouble." Elias gritted his teeth at the mention of Blackjack Morgan. The outlaw had been a thorn in his side for years, always one step ahead of the law. "If it's Morgan, we'll deal with him. But until we have proof, I don't want anyone spreading rumors. This town's on edge as it is." The saloon doors swung open, and Clara Dawson strode out, her dark eyes sharp and her lips curved in a knowing smile. She wore a crimson dress that swished around her ankles, and her presence commanded attention. "Marshal," she said, her voice smooth as silk, "you might want to reconsider dismissing those rumors. I've been hearing things too, and not just from some drunks at the saloon." Elias crossed his arms. "What kind of things?" Clara leaned against the door frame, her expression serious. "Whispers about a vigilante, someone who's been taking justice into their own hands. A few weeks ago, a gang of rustlers disappeared without a trace. Their horses were found wandering the hills, but no sign of the men. And now this Phantom Rider shows up? It's too much to be a coincidence." Caleb's eyes lit up. "See? I told you there's something out there." Elias sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Even if there is, it's not our concern unless they break the law. We've got enough to deal with, like keeping Blackjack Morgan and his gang from tearing this town apart." Clara stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Be careful, Marshal. If this Phantom Rider is real, they might not be on your side." Before Elias could respond, Emily Batten came running up, her long blonde hair tumbling down her back. Her blue eyes were wide with worry. "Elias," she said breathlessly, "you need to come to the ranch. Something's happened." Elias's heart sank. Emily was his older sister, and she rarely came to town unless it was urgent. "What is it, Em?" She hesitated, glancing at Caleb and Annie. "I think you should see for yourself." The ride to the Big B Ranch was tense and silent. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the hills were almost dark. Emily led the way, her horse's hooves kicking up dust as she rode ahead. Caleb and Annie followed close behind, their hands never straying far from their weapons. When they reached the ranch, Elias dismounted and surveyed the scene. The main house was intact, but the lean-to barn that held their hay had been burned to the ground. Smoke still rose from the charred remains, and the acrid smell stung his nose. "What happened?" Elias asked, obviously getting upset. Emily pointed to the barn. "I don't know. I heard the horses panicking and ran outside, but by the time I got there, it was too late. And then I found this." She handed him a piece of wood, blackened by fire. Carved into it were the same words Caleb had found on the wagon. "Justice rides at night." Elias's grip tightened on the wood. "Whoever's behind this, they're sending a message." Caleb glanced nervously at the hills. "You think it's the Phantom Rider?" Elias didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the dark horizon, where the hills loomed like silent sentinels. Somewhere out there, a shadow was moving, and Marshal Elias Grey was determined to find out what it wanted. Chapter 2. Smoke in the Shadows. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The hills surrounding the Big B Ranch loomed like dark giants, their jagged edges cutting into the starless sky. Marshal Elias Grey stood at the edge of the burned lean-to. There was a nervousness in his stomach as he examined the charred remains. The faint smell of smoke still lingered, mingling with the earthy scent of the surrounding fields. Caleb Boone crouched nearby, running his fingers over the scorched ground. His usual easygoing demeanor was gone, replaced by a tense focus. "Marshal," he said, "this fire wasn't an accident. Look here." He pointed to a small pile of blackened rags near the edge of the barn. Someone used oil-soaked cloth to start it. This was definitely deliberate. Elias nodded grimly. "I figured as much. Whoever did this wanted to send a message." Emily Batten stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her long hair shimmered faintly in the moonlight, but her face was pale. "Elias," she said softly, "why would someone target the ranch? We haven't done anything to anyone." Elias turned to her, his expression softening. "It's not about you, Em. It's about me. Someone's trying to get my attention." Just then, Annie McGraw stepped out of the shadows, her rifle slung over her shoulder. Her auburn hair glinted like fire in the dim light. "Well, they've got it," she said. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Before Elias could answer, a distant sound cut through the night, a low, mournful whistle, like the cry of a bird. It echoed through the hills, sending a shiver down Caleb's spine. "What in the world was that?" said Caleb, his hand instinctively going to his gun. Elias's eyes narrowed as he scanned the darkness. "Stay sharp. We're not alone out here, you know." The whistle came again, closer this time. It was followed by the faint sound of hoofs on the ground, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was riding wanted to be heard. The group tensed, their hands hovering over their weapons. "Marshal," Annie said quietly, "you think it's—" "Could be," Elias interrupted. "Stay close." The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the hills. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. A rider on a black horse cloaked in shadow. The horse's mane gleamed like silk in the moonlight, and the rider's face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. They wore a long black coat that billowed slightly in the breeze, and their gloved hands held the reins with an eerie calm. Caleb's breath hitched. "It's them," he whispered. "The Phantom Rider." The rider stopped at the edge of the ranch, their horse pawing the ground restlessly. For a moment, they simply sat there, watching. The air was thick with tension, and no one dared to move. Elias stepped forward, his hand resting on his revolver. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice steady. "What do you want?" The rider didn't answer. Instead, they raised a hand and pointed toward the hills. The gesture was slow and deliberate, as if they were issuing a challenge. Elias's eyes narrowed. "If you've got something to say it. Otherwise, get off my land." The rider tilted their head slightly, as if considering his words. Then, without a sound, they turned their horse and rode back into the darkness. The hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving the group in stunned silence. "What in tarnation?" Caleb said, his voice shaking. "They didn't even say anything." "They didn't have to," Elias said through his teeth. "They're trying to draw us out. They want us to follow them." Annie shook her head. "And what if it's a trap?" Elias glanced at the burned barn, then at Emily, who was still trembling. "It doesn't matter. They've already made this personal. We can't let them think they can get away with this." Caleb hesitated. "Marshal, are you sure about this? We don't know what we're walking into." Elias's eyes were cold and determined. "That's why we're going to be careful. Annie, you stay here with Emily. Caleb, you're with me. We're going to find out who this Phantom Rider is and put an end to this." Annie opened her mouth to protest, but Elias cut her off. "That's an order, Deputy. Keep Emily safe." Annie nodded reluctantly, her grip tightening on her rifle. "Fine. But you'd better come back in one piece." Elias and Caleb mounted their horses, the animals snorting nervously as if sensing the danger ahead. Without another word, they rode off into the hills, following the faint trail left by the Phantom Rider. The hills were dark and silent, the only sound the soft crunch of hooves on dry earth. Caleb rode close to Elias, his eyes darting nervously at every shadow. "Marshal," he said quietly, "you really think this is a good idea? Maybe we should have brought Annie. After all, she is one of the best guns around. What if they're leading us straight to Blackjack Morgan?" "Then we'll deal with him," Elias said firmly. "But I don't think this is Morgan's style. He's not one for theatrics." Caleb nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "Still, this whole thing gives me the creeps. It's like they're watching us." Elias didn't respond. His focus was on the trail ahead, where the faint outline of hoofprints led deeper into the hills. The air grew colder as they climbed higher, and the trees seemed to close in around them. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the night, a gunshot. Elias and Caleb pulled their horses to a stop, their hands flying to their weapons. "Ambush!" Elias shouted, just as another shot rang out, this one striking the ground inches from Caleb's horse. From the shadows, figures emerged, men with bandanas covering their faces, their guns glinting in the moonlight. There were at least 5 of them, and they had the lawmen surrounded. "Looks like you boys took the bait," one of the outlaws sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "Blackjack sends his regards." Elias's eyes were cold as he drew his revolver. "You tell Blackjack he's made a mistake." The outlaw laughed. "Oh, I don't think so, Marshal. You're outnumbered, and there ain't no one coming to save you." But before the outlaws could make their move, a piercing whistle cut through the air, the same eerie sound from before. The outlaws froze, their eyes darting nervously toward the hills. And then, like a shadow out of the night, the Phantom Rider appeared. Chapter 3. The Phantom Strikes. The Phantom Rider emerged from the darkness like a wraith, their black horse rearing up with a shrill whinny that echoed through the hills. The outlaws froze, their bravado melting into unease as the shadowy figure loomed above them. The rider's wide-brimmed hat cast their face in shadow, and the long black coat billowed in the cold night wind. Marshal Elias Grey didn't waste the moment of distraction. "Caleb, cover me!" he barked, diving off his horse and rolling behind a boulder as a gunshot cracked through the air. Caleb Boone snapped out of his shock, drawing his revolver and firing off a shot that sent one of the outlaws diving for cover. "Marshal, what the is going on here?" he shouted, his voice tight with panic. "Focus, Boone!" Elias growled, peering around the edge of the boulder. The outlaws were scrambling, their attention split between the lawmen and the Phantom Rider, who remained eerily still atop their horse, watching. The leader of the outlaws, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, snarled and waved his gun toward the rider. "I don't care who you are. You're dead if you don't get out of here," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The Phantom Rider didn't respond. Instead, they raised a gloved hand and pointed directly at the leader. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and chilling. It was as if death itself had marked him. The leader's bravado faltered. "Shoot him!" he screamed, his voice breaking. "Shoot him now!" The outlaws opened fire, their bullets tearing through the night. But the Phantom Rider moved like a ghost, their horse darting to the side with unnatural speed. The rider's black coat seemed to blend into the shadows, making them a near-impossible target. Elias took advantage of the chaos, firing off 2 quick shots. One outlaw dropped with a cry, clutching his leg, while another dove behind a tree. Caleb, emboldened by the marshal's precision, let out a whoop and fired at the leader, forcing him to duck behind a rock. "Marshal, they're panicking!" Caleb shouted, reloading his revolver with shaking hands. "We've got him on the run!" But Elias wasn't so sure. His eyes flicked to the phantom rider who had dismounted and was now moving through the shadows with an almost supernatural grace. The rider's movements were fluid and silent, their black coat trailing behind them like smoke. They carried no gun, only a long, curved blade that glinted in the moonlight. The outlaws didn't see the rider coming until it was too late. One of them, crouched behind a fallen log, let out a strangled cry as the phantom rider appeared behind him, the blade flashing once before the man crumpled to the ground. The other outlaws turned, their faces pale with terror. "It's a demon!" one of them screamed, dropping his gun and bolting into the trees. The others hesitated, their fear paralyzing them. Elias took the opportunity to step out from behind his cover, his revolver trained on the leader. "Drop your weapon," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. The leader turned to him, his scarred face twisted with rage and desperation. "You think you've won, Marshal? Blackjack's gonna—" Before he could finish, the phantom rider appeared behind him, their blade pressed to his throat. The leader froze, his eyes wide with terror. "Enough," the rider said, their voice low and cold. It was the first time they had spoken, and the sound sent a chill down Elias's spine. It was a voice that carried the weight of judgment, as if it belonged to someone who had seen the worst the world had to offer, and survived. The leader dropped his gun, his hands trembling. "Please," he whispered, "don't kill me." The phantom rider leaned in close, their voice a deadly whisper. "Justice rides at night." With a swift motion, they struck the man's temple with the hilt of their blade, knocking him unconscious. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader fall, scattered into the darkness, their shouts fading into the distance. Elias lowered his gun, his heart pounding. "Caleb, you all right?" he called out. Caleb emerged from behind a tree, his face pale but determined. "I'm fine, Marshal. What about—" He gestured toward the phantom rider, who was now standing over the unconscious leader. Elias approached cautiously, his revolver still in hand. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Why are you doing this?" The phantom rider turned to him, their face still hidden in shadow. For a moment they said nothing, their silence heavy with meaning. Then they spoke. "Red Bluff County has been poisoned by men like him," they said, their voice steady and cold. "Men who think they're above the law. I'm here to remind them that justice is watching." Elias's jaw tightened. "Justice doesn't come from the shadows. It comes from the law." The rider tilted their head, as if considering his words. "The law has its limits, Marshal. Sometimes justice needs a sharper edge." Before Elias could respond, the rider mounted their horse in one fluid motion. They looked down at him, their dark eyes glinting beneath the brim of their hat. "Stay out of my way, Marshal," they said, "or you'll find out what happens to those who stand between justice and vengeance." With that, they spurred their horse and disappeared into the night, leaving Elias and Caleb standing in stunned silence. Caleb let out a shaky breath. "Marshal, what do we do now?" Elias stared after the phantom rider, his mind racing. "We find out who they are," he said finally, "and we stop them, before they turn this county into a graveyard." But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the phantom rider was more than just a vigilante. They were a force of nature, and Red Bluff County would never be the same. Chapter 4. The Trap in the Canyon. The morning was different in Red Bluff County. The hills around seemed to whisper, calling out names. The weathered rocks bearing witness to the passages of time, stories being whispered. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on Marshal Elias Grey as he stood in his office, staring at the map of the surrounding area pinned to the wall. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the marked locations of recent attacks. The burned wagon, the ranch fire, and now the ambush in the hills. All of it pointed to one thing: someone was orchestrating chaos, and the phantom rider was at the center of it. Caleb Boone leaned against the desk, thinking about Emily and how he was going to protect her. His usual humor was gone, replaced by a grim determination. "Marshal, we can't just sit here. That phantom rider's out there, and so's Blackjack Morgan. We've got to do something." Elias turned to him, his voice low and steady. "We are doing something, Caleb. We're going to set a trap." Caleb raised an eyebrow. A trap? For who? The rider or Blackjack? Both, Elias said, his tone leaving no room for argument. If the rider's after Morgan, they'll show up when he does. And if we can draw Morgan out, we'll kill two birds with one stone. Annie McGraw, who had been cleaning her rifle in the corner, looked up. And how exactly do you plan to draw out Blackjack? He's not stupid, Marshal. He's not going to walk into a trap unless he thinks he's got the upper hand. Elias's lips pressed into a thin line. That's why we're going to make him think he does. By midday, the plan was in motion. Word spread quickly through the saloon and the trading posts. A shipment of gold was being transported through Red Bluff Canyon, escorted by none other than Marshal Elias Grey himself. It was a lie, of course, but one designed to lure Blackjack Morgan out of hiding. The canyon was the perfect place for an ambush, narrow with high cliffs on either side. It was also the perfect place to turn the tables. Elias, Caleb, and Annie this time rode out to the canyon under the cover of dusk, their horses kicking up dust as they made their way along the winding trail. The air was heavy with tension, the silence broken only by the occasional howl of the wind through the canyon. "You sure this is going to work, Marshal?" Caleb asked, his voice low. "It'll work," Elias said, though his grip on the reins was tight. "Morgan won't be able to resist the chance to take me out and steal the gold. He's too greedy for that." Annie glanced at him. "And what about the Phantom Rider? You think they'll show up too?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't have to. Deep down, he knew the rider would come. They always did. The canyon was eerily quiet as the group set up their trap. Elias and Caleb positioned themselves on the trail, their rifles hidden beneath their coats, while Annie climbed up to a rocky outcrop overlooking the path. From her vantage point, she could see the entire canyon, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The minutes stretched into hours, the tension growing with each passing moment. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the canyon walls. Caleb shifted nervously in his saddle, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "Marshal," he whispered, "what if they don't show?" "They'll show," Elias said, his voice calm but firm. "Just stay ready." And then, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the hills, they heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats. The group tensed, their eyes fixed on the trail ahead. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls, until a group of riders appeared around the bend. It was Blackjack Morgan and his gang. The outlaw leader rode at the front, his scarred face twisted into a cruel grin. He was flanked by 6 men, all armed to the teeth and looking ready for a fight. They pulled their horses to a stop a few yards away, their eyes scanning the trail. "Well, well," Blackjack drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Marshal Grey, out here all alone with a shipment of gold. You must think I'm stupid." Elias didn't flinch. "You're here, aren't you?" Blackjack laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Fair point. But I'm not walking into your little trap, Marshal. I've got the high ground this time." At his signal, more outlaws appeared on the cliffs above, their rifles trained on Elias and Caleb. The lawmen were surrounded. Caleb's face went pale. "Marshal, this isn't looking good." Elias's jaw tightened. "Stay calm. We're not done yet." Blackjack leaned forward in his saddle, his grin widening. "Any last words, Marshal?" Before Elias could respond, a piercing whistle cut through the air, the same eerie sound they had heard the night before. The outlaws froze, their eyes darting nervously toward the cliffs. And then, chaos erupted. The Phantom Rider appeared on the ridge above, their black horse rearing up as they let out a sharp cry. The outlaws on the cliffs turned their guns toward the rider, but the figure moved like a shadow, their blade flashing in the fading light. One by one, the outlaws fell, their cries echoing through the canyon. Elias seized the moment. "Now!" he shouted, drawing his revolver and firing at Blackjack. The outlaw leader ducked, cursing, as Caleb opened fire on the men below. Annie, from her perch above, picked off the outlaws with deadly precision, her rifle cracking like thunder. The canyon was a storm of gunfire and shouts, the air thick with smoke and dust. Blackjack, realizing the tide had turned, spurred his horse and bolted down the trail. Elias didn't hesitate. "Caleb, stay here! Annie, cover me!" he shouted, spurring his horse after the fleeing outlaw. The chase was wild and dangerous, the narrow trail winding through the canyon like a snake. Blackjack pushed his horse to its limits, but Elias was relentless, his eyes fixed on the man who had caused so much pain and chaos. As they rounded a bend, Blackjack's horse stumbled, throwing him to the ground. Elias dismounted, his gun trained on the outlaw as he approached. "It's over, Morgan," he said, his voice cold and steady. "You're done." Blackjack sneered, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "You think this changes anything, Marshal? There's always going to be men like me." "Maybe," Elias said, "but not in my town." Before he could cuff the outlaw, the phantom rider appeared, their horse stepping out of the shadows. They dismounted, their blade glinting in the moonlight. Elias raised a hand. "This one's mine." The rider tilted their head, their dark eyes unreadable. "Justice doesn't belong to you, Marshal," they said. "It belongs to the people." Elias's grip on his gun tightened. "Not like this. Not with blood." The rider hesitated, their blade hovering in the air. For a moment it seemed as though they might strike. But then, with a sharp motion, they sheathed the blade and mounted their horse. "Next time, Marshal," they said, their voice low and cold. "Next time, you won't stop me." And with that, they disappeared into the night, leaving Elias alone with Blackjack Morgan and the weight of what was to come. Chapter 5. Justice at Dawn. The first light of dawn crept over the hills of Red Bluff County, painting the rugged landscape in light color hues. The town was quiet. The streets empty save for a few early risers who whispered nervously about the events of the night before. Word had already spread. Blackjack Morgan had been captured, and the phantom rider had once again vanished into the shadows. Marshal Elias Grey sat in his office, his hat resting on the desk in front of him. His face was drawn, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Across from him, Blackjack Morgan sat in a chair, his hands bound with thick rope. The outlaw's scarred face was twisted into a sneer, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. "You think this is over, Marshal?" Blackjack said, his voice low and venomous. "You think locking me up is going to change anything? There's more men like me out there. You can't stop us all." Elias leaned forward, his gaze steady and unyielding. "Maybe not, but I can stop you, and that's a start." The door creaked open, and Caleb Boone stepped inside, his face pale but determined. "Marshal, the townsfolk are gathering outside. They want to see him." Elias nodded, rising to his feet. "Let's give them what they came for." The town square was alive with murmurs as Elias and Caleb led Blackjack Morgan out of the jailhouse. The outlaw's hands were still bound, and his head was held high, though his bravado seemed to falter under the weight of so many watchful eyes. The townsfolk lined the streets, their faces a mix of relief, anger, and curiosity. At the center of the square stood a makeshift platform, hastily constructed for the occasion. Elias guided Blackjack up the steps, his hand firm on the outlaw's arm. Caleb followed close behind, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Elias turned to face the crowd, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "Blackjack Morgan has terrorized this town and its people for too long. He's stolen, burned, and killed without remorse. But today, justice will be served." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising like a wave. But as the noise subsided, a figure stepped forward from the edge of the square. It was Clara Dawson, her crimson dress catching the morning light. Her dark eyes were sharp, her expression unreadable. "Marshal," she called out, her voice cutting through the air. "What about the phantom rider? Are they part of this justice you speak of?" The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to Elias. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "The phantom rider is not the law," he said finally. "They've taken matters into their own hands, and while their intentions may be noble, their methods are not. Justice must come from the law, not from the shadows." Clara's lips curved into a faint smile, but she said nothing more. She stepped back into the crowd, her presence lingering like a shadow. As the sun climbed higher, Elias and Caleb prepared to transport Blackjack to the nearest federal prison. The outlaw sat in the back of a wagon, his hands and feet shackled. Caleb climbed onto the driver's seat while Elias mounted his horse, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You think the rider's watching us?" Caleb asked, his voice low. Elias didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the hills, where the shadows still clung to the rocks like ghosts. "Maybe," he said finally, But if they are, they'll know this isn't over. The wagon creaked as it rolled out of town, the crowd parting to let it pass. The townsfolk watched in silence, their faces a mix of hope and uncertainty. For the first time in a long time, Red Bluff County felt a little safer. But the memory of the Phantom Rider lingered, a reminder that justice was not always black and white. That night, as the town settled into an uneasy calm, Elias stood on the porch of his office, staring out at the darkened hills. The events of the past few days played over and over in his mind. The fires, the ambush, the chase through the canyon, and always the Phantom Rider loomed in the background, a shadowy figure that defied understanding. "You think they'll come back?" Caleb asked, stepping out onto the porch beside him. Elias didn't look at him. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if they do, we'll be ready." Caleb nodded, though his expression was troubled. "You think they're a villain, Marshal? Or a hero?" Elias sighed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think there's something in between, and that's what makes them dangerous." Far away, in the hills above Red Bluff County, the Phantom Rider watched the town from a distance. Their black horse stood still beneath them, its breath visible in the cool night air. The rider's face was hidden beneath the brim of their hat, but their eyes were sharp, taking in every detail. They reached into their coat and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Unfolding it, they revealed a list of names. Names of men who had wronged the people of Red Bluff County. Black Jack Morgan's name was at the top, crossed out with a single, sharp line. The rider folded the paper and tucked it away, their gloved hand resting on the hilt of their blade. With a soft nudge, they turned their horse and disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the faint echo of hoofbeats behind. Justice had been served, and the town of Red Bluff quiet for now, but the Phantom Rider's work was far from over.
Thanks for riding along, partner. If you enjoyed this tale from the wild frontier, give us a like and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Until next time, keep your boots dusty and your aim true.